can't hear you.
I too can't hear.
University of Maryland Eastern Shore.
It's online. They can't hear. I'm working on it.
We can hear her now.
Still cannot hear Dr. Stevenson.
Here? Okay. And you will have to stay behind the podium.
Okay. So you got that? I'll start again. Welcome this evening to another of our lectures in a lecture series sponsored by the UMES Committee for Social Justice and Civic Engagement. Throughout the semester, we've had a number of presentations in which the speakers have focused on social justice, and tonight will be no different. We have with us Dr. Jack Wennersten, a longtime professor here at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, a professor emeritus, which is a very distinguished designation. It means that while you're not officially affiliated with the university, during your career, you accomplished things that gave very important academic and intellectual life to the university, and so you're part of the heritage of the university. Dr. Wennersten had a long and distinguished career here at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it before he comes to the podium and speaks to us. For more than 40 years, John R. Wennersten, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, has been writing about the social, cultural, and natural history of the Chesapeake. His books include The Oyster Wars of Chesapeake Bay, Maryland's Eastern Shore, A Journey in Time and Place, and The Chesapeake, an environmental biography. He's an authority on the region's historical development. His books, The Historic Waterfront of Washington, D.C., and Anacostia, The Death and Birth of an American River. Dr. Wennersten has done podcasts on environmental issues based on his book, Rising Tides, Environmental Refugees in the 21st Century, with the Baltimore Sun, and he's written numerous newspaper and scholarly articles dealing with Chesapeake Bay. His new book, Strange Fruit, Racism and Community Life in the Chesapeake Since 1850, explores the contours of slavery, segregation, lynching, and civil rights agitation. He served on the board of directors of the Anacostia Watershed Society for 15 years and also served as a commissioner from Washington, D.C. for 12 years in the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. I will say this, in reading this book, it was fascinating, and I'm seriously, with that, I'm not saying enough about it. If you didn't know anything about Somerset County, this is the book to read. If you didn't know anything about the relationship between African Americans and the white community here, this is the book to read. So Dr. Wennersten is going to come before us now and tell us a little bit about his research, and I'm sure you will come away with this much more informed than you were when you came. And thank you for all of our people online that are watching. We will have a Q&A at the end. Raise your hand, and we will have Mr. Jason Bartman, our technical associate here, who's been very good throughout these series, who will allow you to ask your question after you raise your hand. So at this point, Dr. Wennersten, come before us and impart some words of wisdom.
Thank you, Dean Stevenson, and a special thanks to President Heidi Anderson for making this opportunity available to me. In riding around the campus today, I see a campus that did not exist when I came here in 1972. So many new buildings, so many new programs. It almost boggles the mind to think of the light year change that has taken place on this campus since those halcyon days in 1972 when I came. I stand before you using the latest technology. There are those people sitting in the audience who remember that technology in 1972 was nothing more than an office full of desks with one telephone with little slips that you filled out because someone would call one of your colleagues and you would leave a slip that said why you were out. And that was the sum total of the experience. There was no internet. There was no voicemail. There was no email. There was just the everlasting presence of the Eastern Shore with its heritage of troubled race relations. In 1972, there were, on a good day, maybe somewhere between 400 to 450 students. Most of the students stayed on campus during the week and fled for the greater reaches of Baltimore and Washington and the DC suburbs on the weekend. The town was not exactly hospitable to students from a historically Black campus. You might say that there was a kind of Cold War that existed between the university, which was then called the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, which took the new name in 1970 from Maryland State College. It was a kind of a tense time because the people in the community still remembered the uprising of students from Maryland State College in 1964 when they came marching down into the streets of Princess Anne, demonstrating for many things, but of all, the right to be able to sit and have a hamburger in a restaurant. The campus itself was involved in a period of great uncertainty because it had just gotten a new chancellor by the name of Archie Buffkins, who was talking a new language of multiracial education. And many of the old Black faculty did not know quite what to make of multiracial education. And there were factions. There were the old line factions led by a science professor by the name of William Link that didn't want to see much change and was a bit upset by the changes that Chancellor Buffkins wanted to bring on the campus. And then there were the younger Black faculty, hot on the trail of change, full of the civil rights vision. And then there were the white faculty coming in, many with good credentials. And of course, when you mention the term white faculty, people out in the community, they immediately knew what that meant. To be a white faculty teaching at a Black college meant obviously that you were a communist Jew from New York City. And you were coming in to raise hell, and they didn't want you there. In coming into the town of Princess Anne for the first time, my wife, who was from New York City, and I, who had been living in Europe, saw the town of Princess Anne. There was a blinker light. My wife started to cry. She says, "Where are we, Jack?" And I mentioned it to someone else, and I said, "Where are we exactly?" He said, "Well, it's not the end of the world, but you can see it from here." It was an isolating experience in many respects. And so here we are trying to carve out new educational programs at a time of great change and ferment. Chancellor Buffkins had his problems with the faculty. He had his problems with the community. He was quite outspoken and didn't worry about who he was offending. And ultimately, he was attacked by one of his own staff members over a question of financial probity, the way money was being spent. And he ended up in the hospital and quickly then resigned and went on to become an administrator at the Kennedy Center after a short interim period at College Park in central administration. And so I'm trying to make sense out of all this as a historian at the same time, where the history of the regions just virtually oozed out at me. Names on the buildings. Murphy Hall, named after John Murphy, an ex-slave who founded the Baltimore Afro-American. Trigg Hall, Frank Trigg, a one-armed black educator who was a close friend of Booker T. Washington. Kaya Hall, named after Thomas Kaya, who literally single-handedly, as a minister and educator, kept Princess Anne Academy whole during the 1920s and 1930s. And then as I looked out in the community, we saw residue of the old plantation lifestyle all over the place, with classic mansions like Beverly, Kingston Hall, and in the town, Teakle Mansion. These were evidences of a time that supposedly was past. But as William Faulkner has reminded us, the past isn't really past. And when I began poking around a little bit, I began to find a rich and variegated past of race, culture, and social change that simultaneously led me to conclude that too much time is spent on the big national issues. Virtually from very outset, we have been concerned with the major obvious facts of race relations in this country, such as slavery, the Civil War, the Emancipation, Brown versus the Board of Education, freedom marches, Black Lives Matter. But we know relatively little of what Black people were thinking about over the course of 3 centuries. And for whites such as myself to write about Black thinking over 3 centuries of experience is the ultimate in presumptuousness. And so what I did instead was I wrote a book about the interplay between whites and Blacks in Somerset and the Chesapeake community generally. And tonight I'd just like to highlight a few of the things that I found that may be of interest to you if you choose to read the book. One of the things that people don't realize is the local is the national. Let me give you an illustration. A short time ago, this book came out, edited by a reporter for the New York Times, and she made quite a splash with it. Nicole Jones, the 1619 Project. It's a kind of manifesto of the Black experience and its centrality in the American historical drama. But what does not come out in this book is when you talk about 1619, You're talking about the Eastern Shore. You're talking about Maryland. And in 1625, some of those blacks who came over on the first ships, like the White Lion, the Treasurer, and others, ended up in Somerset County. Antonio and Mary Johnson made their way from what was then Point Comfort, which is now Hampton, Virginia, and settled here in 1625. And they came out of indentured servitude, which is to say that people think that automatically slavery established itself in the New World of North America full blown in the 17th century, when it did not. The relations between whites and blacks in the 17th century were extremely fluid. And if I were to describe the nature of the relationship between the bonds between Africans and white English tobacco farmers, I would say that these people were more or less the African Americans, that is, were indentured servants rather than slaves. The Johnsons moved up into Somerset County. They acquired property. They had farms. They sued in the courts. They hired lawyers. And the idea that slavery existed immediately as a whole institution is disproved by the historical facts. And indeed, facts do have a way of mattering. Facts sometimes get in the way. We don't like to have facts. There is a governor of the state of Virginia who is very, very much worried about facts because he thinks that the facts of the history of American race relations will make school children worried and possibly unhappy. Well, it's not the task of history to make people happy. It's the task of history to allow people to realize the truth. And indeed, this whole outbreak of reaction against the teaching of race relations in the public schools is generated by a fear that somehow school children will be made to feel guilty about their past. The past is the past, and it needs to be recognized for what it is. And Antonio Johnson and his wife Mary, coming over from the western portion of Africa, now referred to as Angola, came over, learned English, prospered, intermarried with the population, and their story until recently has not been told. A while back, there were a group of historians at William and Mary University who wrote a book called My Known Ground, which details the experiences of the Johnsons and the Driggises. When I came across the Driggises, I said, that's an odd name for early families on the Eastern Shore. Driggis was shorthand for Rodrigues, a Portuguese name. Even today, there are places on the Eastern Shore in Delaware and in Maryland that are named Angola. There are places on the Eastern Shore that are named Santo Domingo. Testimony to the fact that there are names on the land that have special significance. Also, in the nature of human relations, life can get very complicated. You know, we sometimes say, I wanted to do something, but my life got in the way. Life does get in the way, and I will just give you one quick little story. In the 1680s, an Irish woman was deported to Maryland. She was swept up in the general arrest of people who were classified as either pickpockets or sneak thieves or whatnot. And these people were thrown into indentured servitude and deported to the New World. Nell, an Irish girl who had somehow made her way from Ireland to London, was caught up in one of these sweeps and was purchased. Her 5 years of indentured servitude was purchased by George Calvert, the Lord Proprietor of the Maryland colony. George Calvert thought this would be an excellent bride for one of his farmers in Maryland. And so here's Irish Nell coming into the New World. And very quickly, she develops a romantic relationship with a slave named George Butler. The Lord Proprietor, who owned Irish Nell's time, was a little upset. And he said, I would like you to marry this white planter. And Irish Nell said, no. And George Calvert said, why? She said, I would rather marry the slave George than marry you and be part of your vast dominion of Maryland. So, in a Catholic ceremony, which George Calvert had to witness, she married George Butler, and by the law of the time, she consigned herself to being enslaved for life, because that was the law, that if a white woman married an African, she was to take on his status, and her children were to take on that status. This is the story of Irish Nell. She went on to be a seamstress, a midwife. She and George Butler had 7 children, so I guess they had something going on. And her children gradually made their way out of slavery, either through escape or through the courts, because the state of Maryland, the Maryland colony, changed the law. And by 1700, the law said that if you were descended from a free-born woman, you were essentially free, which meant that all of her grandchildren were able to get out of slavery. So the story of race relations in the very beginning of this country is much more complex than we would think. And Antonio and Mary Johnson and others acquiring property led me to question, how extensive was freedom for what became African Americans on the Eastern Shore? And what I found is that over time, by 1860, over half the population of African Americans in Somerset County was classified as, quote, free Negro, which meant that the free black population in Somerset was a constant worry to slave owners who thought that these would be encouraging other people to flee from slavery. Now, were there plantations in Somerset County? Yes. Large farms. Did they grow cotton or tobacco? No, because tobacco went out of fashion in Somerset County because of the poor quality of the soil. And they turned to other things such as wheat and grain products. A testimony to the fact that slavery had many uses. I looked up some statistics on slavery in the United States and found this, that in 1860 there were some 4 million slaves in the United States. And only 4.8% of the population who were white owned slaves. was a very small minority kind of holding, but more powerful economically than I had anticipated. The sum total of the slave population in the United States in 1860 was equal to the value of all of the railroads and all of the textiles in New England. It was something well worth fighting over as far as the South. Well worth fighting over. And in Somerset County, slavery was so entrenched that not even the presence of a large free Negro population could dislodge it from its popularity. A young newspaper reporter came down into Somerset County to report on agriculture and became fascinated by the complexity of the race relations. For example, he noticed that some free blacks, some slaves were nearly white. Some were of a deeper hue. Some seemed to walk around with a great amount of freedom, although their status was slave. So he wrote a book about it called The Entailed Hat. And the first time I read The Entailed Hat, I said, oh, this is a stupid book about a guy who's forced to wear a 18th century hat that he has inherited over the centuries, and no one in the community likes him very much. But the more I read into The Entailed Hat, the more I saw that this was a complex investigation into the race relations of Somerset County on the eve of the American Civil War. And The Entailed Hat was published right after the war. And in this, we see numerous instances and references to the fact that there were descendants in the community who were directly related to the planters in the form of daughters, nieces, sons, and that many of the servants in what were some of the best and spacious manor houses on the eastern shore were of a mulatto color, and they all knew who their fathers were, but the wives of the fathers didn't know who they were. Try to imagine that, as Mary Boykin Chestnut said in her classic book, Diary from Dixie, she said that a white mistress from any plantation can tell you who the black illegitimate offspring are of white planters on every plantation except her own. And it's well worth reading today, for it gives us a good example of the fact that it wasn't all just either or. It was either or and with a very big and. And from the founding of the 17th century onward, free blacks have played a very interesting role in Somerset County. For example, in the creation of the country of Liberia, Somerset County was in the forefront of what was then called the Maryland Colonization Society. And the Maryland Colonization Society was set up ostensibly to colonize free blacks and recently emancipated slaves in Africa. It was never extremely successful, but nevertheless, there was a colonization, and I was astonished one day to attend a faculty meet and greet at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore to meet Agnes Dennis. Agnes Dennis was the widow of Cecil Dennis, who was the Ministry of State Affairs in Liberia, who had been killed in a military coup. And as a United Nations refugee, she had been introduced to President John Cole of the University of Maryland system, and he gave her a job. I said, "Your last name is Dennis?" He said, "Yes." There's a Dennis family that has been very prominent in plantation history of Somerset County. And I introduced her to John Dennis, the last scion of the old planter families in Somerset County. And they got along famously. And she became a professor of biology here at the University of Maryland. So here you have free blacks, slavery, Maryland Colonization Society, and then Agnes Dennis. And those of you who are interested, Agnes Dennis's niece writes for the New York Times, and her last name is Cooper. Dennis Cooper. I can't remember her name. Now, up until the outbreak of the war, Somerset County was one of the most pro-slavery counties in the United States. But war and emancipation knocked slavery into cocked hat. And what do you do now that emancipation has come? Well, the first thing that people wanted to do was to say, how are we going to regulate this new system of labor? And they resorted to apprenticeships. That is, all young black men and women under the age of 21 were immediately apprenticed for a period of years. This was Somerset and many other counties on the Eastern Shore way of controlling things. And the only problem with the apprenticeship system was that you had large numbers of Union War veterans who were black, who were African American. And they comprised the 9th Colored Maryland Regiment that fought on the outskirts of Richmond during the period 1863, 1865. And they came back and told the Somerset County commissioners that they were entitled to Civil War pensions, which the Somerset County commissioners were forced to pay because of their military service. So here you have, on the one hand, trying to regulate this post-emancipation African American population. And on the other hand, an unruly group of veterans were coming back demanding change. And the Freedmen's Bureau, set up by General Oliver O. Howard, coming in and apprising the newly emancipated freedmen of what rights they could expect from the government. And it seems to me that these rights fell into several categories. Number one, the right to vote, which ultimately, with the 14th Amendment in 1868, was passed. The right to social equality, the right to own property. When I first came to UMES, I asked some of my African American colleagues, why are so many black faculty members living in these little houses on the campus? They were little houses that had been constructed by the Building and Construction Department, led by Henry Bucks Briggs. And I was told that because they can't get good property out in the community. Yes, they can buy swamp property, the property doesn't perk well, but they just can't get good property. So university or college at that time, or the academy, built all these little houses. And so even as late as 1972, the right to own property was something that was a hot button issue. And then the last thing, civility. How to be treated civilly. When I came in 1972, I had lunch with a man who was a professor in the industrial arts department by the name of Dick Thomas. And Dick was from Uniontown, and we would reminisce about our lives in Pennsylvania. And I said to him, what was the thing that bothered you the most about segregation? Because Dick Thomas and his wife came down to the Maryland State College in the 50s. And he said it wasn't the segregation so much, it was the little microaggressions. I said, well, he didn't use that, I have to use sociological buzzword. But the little things that bothered. I said, well, what little thing? He said, for example, we have faculty members who are Black who have advanced degrees from Cornell University, and when they go into stores, the store owners refer to them by their first name. Not Dr. Jones or Dr. Smith or Professor this or Professor that, but Henry, Jane, and whatnot. And then I said, what else? And he said, when someone from behind the counter changes money when you've made a purchase, how do they do it? And he said, in Princess Anne, the storekeepers would hand the change to a white person like this, and they would hand the change to a Black person like that on the table. Pick it up. He said, it's the little things like that that bothered me. So I started paying greater attention. Later in my career, I ran into a man who was coming back to Princess Anne to return a treatment. I said, John, can we talk about your early career at what was then Maryland State College? He said, sure. I said, you raised a lot of hell in Princess Anne in 1964. You led the whole student body out into the town. You confronted the student body. The town panicked, called in the state police with dogs, and the local volunteer fire department washed all you guys down and drove you back onto the campus. I said, what was your basic reason for doing this? He said, Professor Wennersten, it all was summed up in the word hamburger. Because in those days, you couldn't get served in the restaurants. You had to go around back, press a buzzer, and say, I'd like to buy 2 cheeseburgers, please. And say, pay first, stand over there, get your burgers. No place to sit down, no place to eat. And at a time when the state of Maryland had passed the Equal Opportunity Act and the Equal Accommodation Act, this was clearly out of sync with the rest of the state. So the simple thing like hamburgers galvanized student body in 1964. Just like a simple thing galvanized Gloria Richardson in Cambridge, Maryland, a few years later. When I first started doing some research for this book and reading local newspapers, I came across this very interesting term. Gloria Richardson and her outside. Well, number one, Gloria Richardson wasn't an outside advocate. She came from an established family in Cambridge. Her relatives owned a local undertaking establishment. Her family owned extensive real estate in Cambridge. She herself had gone to school at Howard. And she came back and got a job working for Dorchester County as a social. And as a social worker, she began raising questions about the equality of housing opportunity. She began raising questions about access to voting. Perhaps you don't realize it, but on the Eastern Shore, they used to have a very unique way to vote. It was called $2 in a minute. You got your little miniature whiskey, you got your $2 bill, and then you voted the way people wanted you to vote. So she started a civil rights organization in Cambridge to investigate these things. And she also wanted to have her social work portfolio broadened to include poor whites. And they said, oh, no, Gloria. Like, and so she went back and was talking to some of the more established Black members of the Cambridge community. And they said, Gloria, nonviolence, peace, just agitate a little bit. And she put a group together. And in 1967, she found that she was going nowhere because the city fathers just didn't want to talk to her. Or when she wanted things voted on, the city fathers made sure that the ballot boxes were counted properly so that her initiatives would not become enacted. So finally, one day Gloria Richardson said, I am tired of this whole Gandhi thing. Peace, nonviolence. You know, the hell with this Gandhi thing. We're going to start really agitating. And the town fathers panicked. And they contacted Governor Millard Tawes up in Washington. Now, Millard Tawes at the time was fairly well along in years. He was governor of the state of Maryland. He was from Chrisfield. He was a good old boy. All he wanted to do was to have a successful governorship where there was just peace and tranquility, where people could sit back, pick crabs, drink beer. And he wanted to see some improvement in the public schools, and he wanted to see more tourism on the Eastern Shore. All of a sudden, everything is going to hell in Cambridge. And it's a new age called television. And the TV cameras from the big stations in Washington are beginning to pick up on Gloria Richardson and her group. Millard Tawes' fixer was a young man by the name of Lloyd Simpkins. He was an attorney from Princess Anne. And Tawes and Lloyd Simpkins and a few others said, you know, we got to do something because these people put us in office. They put me in the governor's chair. So what do? He sent in the National Guard, not for 2 weeks, but for 2 years. No other town in the United States was militarily occupied by the United States Army like Cambridge, Maryland was. And of course, Gloria Richardson brought in Stokely Carmichael during one of the early demonstrations. He was wounded and spirited out of town. And then as things really got worse, she brought in H. Rap Brown from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And on one night in 1967, H. Rap Brown stood on top of a car roof and said, if the community doesn't come around, we're going to burn it down. And the phrase burn, baby, burn had its birth in Cambridge, Maryland. Unfortunately, most of the stuff that got burned down was in the Black community. But it shows you the length and breadth of the hostility. President Kennedy at the time, early on, had tried to send his emissary, his attorney general, in the early 60s to try to cool things down because things were starting to heat up long before these riots took place or these upheavals. But you just couldn't wish things away. There is a picture in this book of Gloria Richardson sort of waving away a bayonet from a national. I will see if I can find it for you. You can see there she is waving away this National Guardsman's bayonet. There was gunfire in Cambridge on both sides. There was rock throwing in Cambridge on both sides. And finally, the National Guard tampered it down. And in disgust, Gloria Richardson left Cambridge. She went to New York and never returned. And I said to myself, let's see what the official history of the state of Maryland has to say about Gloria Richardson, what it has to say about John Wilson. I looked in the index, 2 or 3 mentions briefly of Gloria Richardson, 1 mention of John Wilson. This is Maryland by Brugger, Robert Brugger, B-R-U-G-G-E-R. And then I looked up breweries and how many citations were there to breweries in the state of Maryland. I was being frivolous, of course. I said, so if I open up the official history of the state of Maryland, I can learn so much about the brewing industry in the state of Maryland, and I hardly know anything about Gloria Richardson or John Wilson. John Wilson became an organizer for SNCC. He went up to Washington, D.C., ultimately became a member of the city council, and ultimately chair of the D.C. City Council. And today, the Wilson Building in Washington, D.C. is named after him. Wilson himself suffered from chronic depression in his later years. And while everyone hoped that he would have a successful retirement, because he talked about coming back to retire in Princess Anne, he committed suicide. But his legacy lives on. And so when we talk about the national history of civil rights, the national history of Black freedom, it begins locally. 1619 begins on the Eastern Shore. 1619 is essentially a fact that cannot be denied. And so what I have tried to do in this book is to show how local developments over 3 centuries have influenced the course of race relations and racial interaction. Have things improved since 1619? Of course they have. But there are those agonizing facts, like October 1933, when a young black farm boy named Ford Farmwood, who worked for 2 white farmers, got engaged in a conspiracy to rob Mary Denton as she went from her daughter-in-law's place to her farmhouse. Now, it's 1933, the banks are in bad shape, many of them have closed, many are worried about the safety of their money, and many women took to carrying their money in their bodice. Mary Denton was one of them. She was also 81 years old. The plan was As Mary was coming down the path, George Armwood, with a bandana on or disguise, would leap out, reach into the bodice, and take her money. He immediately recognized Armwood, told her family alerted the authorities, and a full-scale manhunt went on until they finally caught Armwood. And they put him in jail. And a mob assembled outside of the jail. They said they wanted to lynch George Armwood for the rape of Mary Dunstan. Now, I don't know how a young farmhand was going to rape an 80-year-old. I guess it could happen. Anyway, Governor Albert Ritchie at the time said, we got to get this guy out of here because we've seen mob violence before in Salisbury, where they threw a black man out the window in a lynching. We have to protect this guy. So they took him out to Baltimore. And then along came the sheriff, Luther Dougherty of Somerset County, with a writ of habeas corpus. You can't do that because you're violating the sovereignty of Somerset County. You must bring him back to stand trial in Princess Anne. The judge who had written the habeas corpus, Robert Brewer, had thought that he could control the mob. All he had to do was to go out and say, guys, go home. Everything's under control. We'll take care of it. Meanwhile, the mob got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they assaulted the jail, broke into the cells, took Armwood out, dragged him to the streets of Princess Anne, hanged him, then took his body down, mutilated it, and then set it on fire, where it burned. In those days, lynchings were considered very popular affairs. Professional photographers went to lynchings, took pictures, which they put on postcards, which you could send to your friends and relatives. Hi, Mom. We're at the lynching, having a wonderful time. Wish you were here. Isabel Wilkerson, in her book Cast, brings this to light in great and thrilling detail. Not a single one of those lynchers who were identified by state troopers was brought to trial. And when I came to Princess Anne in 1972, I started finding out about these things. And a few years later, the Somerset County Bicentennial Commission asked me to write the bicentennial history of Somerset County from 1850 to the present. So I wrote about the lynching. Well, they nearly had a bird, because what they wanted was gone with the wind. What I gave them was racism, violence, and the bicentennial history never saw the light of day. This is in part of that bicentennial history. And so the more that you examine the local, the more the local begins to show that the national is a much more complex historical canvas than we had anticipated. I want to close with something that I wrote. The last page of my book. As this is being written, a national uprising against police violence towards blacks and racial discrimination generally is taking place. It remains to be seen whether it constitutes a turning point in the way we think and act against systemic racism. Given the terrible burden of Chesapeake's history, it's a question that is yet to be answered. As social and environmental activists, Naomi Klein has written, "There can be no reconciliation when the crime is still in progress." And that's what I have to say today. And I'll just make a few remarks about 1619. It's a very controversial book. There's a lot that is right about the book, and there's stuff that is wrong about the book. But as a manifesto, it certainly has kicked over a lot of thinking about where the national agenda should be with regard to a sounder and saner racial policy in the United States. Those of you who are familiar with the controversy that came out, shortly after Nicole Hannah-Jones had written 1619, she was offered a full professorship at the University of North Carolina. That's a pretty nice gig. I wouldn't mind going there myself. But one of the major funders and philanthropists of the University of North Carolina said, nope, no tenured appointment for Nicole Hannah-Jones. You can come as a visiting professor, but none of this tenure professorship. So she said, okay, stop it. She's now at Howard. The affair at Chapel Hill probably did more to advance her career than the book 1619 did. Anyway, it's worth looking at. It's worth reading. It has essays in it by Nicole Hannah-Jones. It has poems. It has fictional essays. It's kind of cookbook. And it starts at 1619 and goes all the way up into the present. Those of you who recall what I said about Irish film, tell your students that all they have to do on their computer is type in the words Irish Nell, and the whole story that is excerpted from the Maryland Hall of Records will be there for them to look at. Which is my way of ending with a little commercial for the Maryland Hall of Records, because they're now digitalizing history, and you can sit in the comfort of your living room when you finally get tired of watching Netflix. You can go to the Hall of Records. Start with Irish Now, and then it'll give you all the keywords that you can find for everything that you're looking at in Maryland's history. All right, are we having a Q&A? Yes. Okay. Someone in the back, go ahead. George. I don't recognize you, George.
I think it was. I read that originally black and white were treated the same, indentured white.
Yes.
The indentured white and black were basically treated the same. Then I think that there was an uprising by black and the white. And at that point, white men
Yeah. Somewhere around 1736, the ball game rules got changed, and slavery for blacks became permanent, and indentured servitude for whites became 5 to 7 years. It was also at that time that blacks were now prohibited from suing for their freedom in the courts, which they could before mid 18th century. So, right. Yeah. Yes, for you folks online, if you have questions, we'll hear you. You have to unmute. I think it's a hot sketch. The technological dinosaur like this giving instructions. Go ahead, John.
A couple of things you mentioned about the intermarriage. I mentioned Dr. Lynch, his widow at that time. I went to her wake down in Accomack, and I was there, and family was there, mostly Western Shore. And the one lady came up to me and said, "You probably wonder about people with the color of our skin." I thought about it, really. She said, "Well, I want to tell you, these were obviously most of them were professional people, educators, and pretty upper class people that were in the family. Said that the blacks and the whites and the Native Americans all intermarried in that county, and we're the result of that." Can you comment on that? That's how I remember it anyway.
I was told early on by a faculty member in the agriculture department. He said, "You know, it's funny about Somerset County. Blacks and whites all have the same names. They don't go to each other's weddings, but they all go to each other's funerals." I thought, interesting. I talked to Ruby about that. And she said, "We have blended in and she said, we're only lightly black. We're only lightly black. And there are reasons for this in Accomack County because there was a very large Indian population. And the black population was relatively small. Many of the people who owned slaves moved out of Accomack County in the late 17th century because the Quakers had and were agitating against slavery. And they wanted to take their property with them. And so that is perhaps part of the reason. That's about as far as I can go with that, John. Go ahead, online.
Dr. Wennersten, how are you? This is
I'm fine.
This is Catherine Barrett Gaines. I think I'm sitting in your seat here at UMES.
Yes, you are.
Can you tell us, and the students that are on with you and sharing this, can you tell us about your sources for this book? I teach my students about multiple reliable sources.
Okay. The first and most reliable source will be the Maryland Hall of Records, Catherine. The second reliable source is there are numerous collections of Maryland newspapers. The Baltimore Library has what they call clip files, where it has been clipping things out of newspapers that deal with everything from lynchings to interracial marriages to segregation. But the mother lode of information about some specific events in Princess Anne I got from the files of the Marylander and Herald, which was a local newspaper right across the street, literally from the Washington Hotel. When I came here, Maryland and Herald was a newspaper that relied mostly on obituaries and legal notices. It was owned by the Byrd family. And the younger Robert Byrd was a student of mine. He said, "I got to get out of the newspaper business. It's a failing thing." But I said, "Oh, what did you and your dad do with all those old newspapers you have?" "Oh, they're upstairs in the attic." So old Wennersten goes up into the attic with the dust, and these things were just laying there. And I went through them. The Washington Post has a very good archive that can be accessed through most libraries. Torrance's book, Old Somerset on the Eastern Shore, gives an excellent background on how Somerset got organized. My wife, Ruth Ellen, wrote her master's thesis on the evolution of Princess Anne Academy over time. I talked to a lot of people who are now deceased. And I asked Bill Robinson for the faculty list from the catalog of 1973-74. And I'm amazed to see that there aren't many of us left. Among those who were in that catalog in 1973-74 are Jack Wennersten, John Grout, Richard Keenan, and I hope that has been helpful. For those of you who don't know Catherine's work, she has been in the forefront of making sure that the history of the region gets told. Hope I
Dr.
answered your question.
Wennersten, it's really scary to me how many of the people you talked about that I know and I've met, and now and sort of now it's kind of frightening that how many of them are deceased, but I share a lot of those names with you. I know Agnes Dennis, I knew Richard Keenan, so it's kind of amazing the overlap. I have to say, you look better than ever. I don't know what kind of secret fountain of youth you have discovered, but you don't look any older than you did last time you came to UMES.
Yeah. Catherine, while I have you on the line, I want you to know that there was an organization, actual name I don't recall, but they went around the country filming testimony about lynchings. And one of the people that they interviewed was Omega Fraser of Princess Anne, who was in the Home Agricultural Extension. And her son was my student at UMES, Bill Jones, who was first African American newscaster at WBOC. You can access that. And if you can't find it, send me a letter and I'll make sure that Bill sends his link to you so you can see. It's quite an interesting interview. Omega Fraser was one of these very, very strong African American women who was sort of like the Oracle of Delphi. And to get the right information, you have to ask. None of this business of pussyfooting around, So the guy who was interviewing her was an inexperienced graduate student. And he finally said to her, "Were you at the lynching?" She says, "Yes, my husband and I had come down to visit relatives, and we were there right after Armwood was killed." I said, "Why didn't you pussyfoot around for 30 minutes? Get to the heart of the man." But anyway, it's a very interesting interview. Thank you for the compliment.
Well, Sherilyn Ifill, when she did her book on the courthouse lawn, she made the observation that every Black resident of Princess Anne remembers that lynching as if they were there, and none of the white people who were all there seem to remember it.
Yeah. There was one of the lynchers who drove a red truck at the time in the 1930s. His nickname was Big Boy Smith. And he really was a big guy. And so 1933, 1973, 74. So I wanted to seek this guy out. And I was asking people where he lived and everything. No, you don't want to go there. You don't want to go there because those people down there are nasty. Okay? I had enough information at the time. But all those guys who got off were defended by Alexander Jones Sr., Esquire, an attorney, who was the coroner for the event. And it was his son, Sandy Jones, who tried to promote racial reconciliation during the Princess Anne uprising of students in 1964. Sandy got so upset with the racist attitudes of the people, and he had grown up with these people, that he ultimately left Somerset County and went to Chestertown, Maryland, where he could be close to his beloved Washington College. Sandy Jones's wife was the sister of Alec McCallum, the great Irish actor. How she ended up in Princess Anne, very interesting question. Well, Sandy was over in England on a Fulbright and acquired a Fulbright education and an Irish wife. Go ahead.
Was a conspiracy with the farmer who had put up arms to the robbery. What was the result for that?
They went to jail, but for short terms. They did go to jail, but they should have received very, very stiff sentences, but they didn't. You know, sometimes things are hidden in plain sight. And the Armwood lynching for years, people knew about it, but nobody talked about it, and it was hidden in plain sight. And all of a sudden, Wennersten comes along, starts poking around, and then later on, other people start poking around, and now it's sort of a major chapter in the history of the Chesapeake region. But I guess the moral to that story is if you don't poke around, you don't learn. But one of the things I have learned is a fact is a fact is a fact. That doesn't change. This happened. This happened. This happened. Now you can put an ideological spin on it if you like. You can interpret it 6 ways from Sunday if you like, but it doesn't detract from the fact. Go ahead, Richard.
First, and then a question. John Brown had mentioned daughter, John Anderson, and when John mentioned that he had a question about marrying blacks and whites, color of skin, and so forth, I remember that Dion was very adamant about Native American heritage. He said in the fact that not just that she was part of the African American white community, but this was one of the things that she would make a number of presentations on to identify herself with that issue. I was wondering if there was any more to that, but my question was, in the town, there are 2 prominent mansions that are kind of out of that, so we say, gone with the wind area, the Eagle Mansion and the Beckford. And I'm wondering if those 2 individuals were at the time that they built those mansions, do you know if they were prominent figures in local politics,
They were not.
Maryland politics, and so on? Or were they just commercial interests on the?
Yeah, a lot of these places got bought up after 1900 by wealthy businessmen as a summer retreat. The most notable one was down at Raccoon Point. I can't remember the name of that one. Down where Lauren Taylor is. And it was bought up by the DuPonts.
Can you
And,
repeat the questions? Can you repeat the questions, please?
Question about the Eagle Mansion and Beckford, both very prominent mansions. I was wondering if individuals who built those establishments were a prominent figure in the community that had any power, because clearly they had to be, I would think, extensive slavery.
yeah. To my knowledge, these mansions were owned by people of great means, but they were not part of the old slaveholding dynasties. The Dennises had long gotten out of the estate business. John Dennis came back to Princess Anne just to retire. He spent his life as an ornithologist, traveling all over the world. The only family that really stayed true to its name was the Dennis family, and they got out of the farming and plantation business long before all this stuff happened. I recently noticed in the paper, those of you who are interested, that Kingston Hall is for sale for $480,000. If you put another $200,000 in, maybe we'll get a decent roof. I don't know. But anyway, those places went out of vogue after a while. Freedom Ainsworth, the man who gave us the instant gas pump, you know, that you can pump gas really quick, but Bedford. And that's the kind of people that went. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wennersten, for what was a very enlightening history of Somerset County. We appreciate you coming, and I'm sure everyone learned everything. This particular presentation has been recorded, so if you would like to see it online, we will be able to make that available for you. I would make an announcement that next Thursday, we will have a lecture by Dr. Beverly Guy Sheftall. She is a professor at Spelman College and was a very close friend of the late Bell Hooks. And so she will be lecturing about the life and times of Bell Hooks next Thursday at 6:30. And you will be able to tune in and watch that virtually as well. The announcement for that is on the UMES webpage, and we will make sure that that is advertised as we move into next week for you to view as well. I want to thank all of you for coming here in the audience today, and also all of you who tuned in online. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you all so much.